Hey guys, what is up? Super K Manrox here, and I am here for my LCK round number 3 overview and analysis video in the Summer Split Playoffs. These are going to be our final 2 series before we narrow it down to top 3, before we get into the semifinals, and of course, later the finals. We will know our first team to qualify officially for the LCK finals and potentially know the format of our regional qualifiers depending on the result of that series. So a lot to figure out here today. If you are interested in my thoughts on how we got here on round 2, round 1, you can check out those videos up in the iCard right now. Of course, up there as well is going to be the LCK Summer Split playlist. That's going to be every single game of the LCK from the regular season onwards in one area that you can go and, see my thoughts and opinions on if you really want to catch back up. Of course, it's not required viewing. That's a lot of games to cover, but it definitely would help to illuminate some of my opinions. Spoiler alert, I definitely will be referencing quite a few of them in this video, but definitely not something you have to check out if you just want to check out this round number 3. We will definitely be giving you all the context you need. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the series that happened this past weekend, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be quickly previewing everything at the end of this. That means the semifinals, who could potentially be making finals, and of course the regional qualifiers as well, because we will know our third team to join the regional qualifiers and have a shot to play their way into Worlds. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. I don't like wasting you guys' time too much at the beginning of these videos, so let's get in to series number 1, and that is, of course, our winners finals. Kicking off the video here, these are the two teams that have been undefeated so far in the playoffs. Both of them have only played one series because they had that bye in round number 1 from being the top 2 seeds, but we all kind of expected to see these two teams here when we were going into the playoffs. It's the number 1 seeded Gen.G taking on the number 2 seeded Hanwha Life Esports. These are the two best teams in the LCK until proven otherwise, both of them with 3-0 sweeps to get here. Gen.G, of course, over Dplus KIA, Hanwha Life over T1, a very big victory for them, but they've felt kind of like a tier above everybody else in terms of their consistency over the course of this year, and honestly, it's not a shock at all to see them here. I know T1 fans are a bit surprised that it was so easy for HLE to beat them, but we've seen that multiple times throughout this year. HLE has actually kind of had T1's number over the course of this year, and so this being kind of your matchup in the top 2, it's not particularly shocking. Gen.G is the super team. Like, they are the number 1 team in the world until proven otherwise. They very narrowly went not undefeated in the regular season. They only lost 1 series to KT Rolster. They only lost 3 games in total in the regular season, and in fact, throughout the entirety of the Summer Split, if you exclude the EWC, they've only lost 3 games. Like, it's ridiculous. It's not even just like, oh, they lost a series. They've lost 3 games, and 2 of them were on one day. Out of every single series that they have won, they have lost 1 game. It is truly exceptional. It is unrealistic to expect them to be able to continue that pace, but that's just how dominant this team has been. They have the most stacked roster in the world by a country mile, at least at the current moment. You've got the best player in the world, in my opinion, in Chovy. You've got Canyon, who most people consider to be the greatest jungler of all time. Keen, who's probably the best top laner in the world. Lehens, who's one of the best supports in the world. And Pays, who's a breakthrough star and my MVP pick for the Summer Split. This is as stacked of a super team as you can get right now in League of Legends, and everyone plays off of each other incredibly well. That's why they are so dangerous. You can't really exploit a weakness from them. You would think a team with so many mechanical players would rely a lot on their ability to just outplay their opponent, and sometimes their macro could slip. That's often what we see from super teams, is that they are much more like early game focused, but that's not the case at all for Gen.G. This is actually kind of a slow team in comparison to a lot of the other top teams in the world because their macro is so clean. Their mid game and their late game is the best in the world. They don't even really rely on just gapping you in lane, although they absolutely will gap you in lane, and that's the scary part. They just win everywhere. Their weakness, quote unquote, is that that they're not super aggressive and super, like, dominating in the early game, and yet they're always up gold because they're just so much better individually than the players that they're playing into. It's genuinely ridiculous how easy it has been for this team to win games over the course of this year, and that is even included against HLE, who definitely have a gigantic mountain to try to climb in this series. You can't really look at this team and see them as favorites in any stretch, but a lot of these players are used to being underdogs in the LCK and on the international stage as well. Players like Zeka obviously have had experience overcoming the odds winning Worlds before. Someone like Viper is a former Worlds winner. You have players like Doran and Peanut and Delight that have been on Gen.G, that were replaced on Gen.G going into this year, looking for some revenge in a pretty big moment. This is a very intriguing series. The only concern for HLE is that they also kind of fall into this, like, we kind of want to play for the mid to late game. Mid game in particular is really where they've been able to blow up a lot of other teams because they are so clinical at being able to take like a 1k gold lead and turn it into a 5k gold lead with not only their mechanics but their decision making specifically in the middle of the game. But that's where Gen.G thrives as well. It's just going to be very difficult for me to imagine a world in which HLE is going to be better at something this series than Gen.G. They have to kind of hope and pray that Gen.G is just taking some games off. I know that feels like really bad analysis for winners finals, and I am high on Hanwha Life. I think that right now they're almost certainly a top 3 team in the world, but that's just how much of a monster Gen.G is at the other end of the tunnel here. Nobody is going to be expected to beat them. Hell, nobody's going to be expected to take a game off of them. HLE certainly hasn't been able to over the course of this split, and so there's really like a lot of worry for HLE, and even if they come out of this series getting blown out, hopefully they can learn something. But if they can come in and win a game or 2, or hell, even 3, I mean, that would be ridiculous. They just gapped T1 in the playoffs. This is not some pushover team. There is certainly something here to be able to capitalize on, but are they going to be able to do that? Or is Gen.G going to be able to keep the narrative alive that they are just unbeatable in these best of 5s? The only way to find out is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and this is not the result that I expected to see here. I did not see this one coming. HLE coming out and just winning the first game of the series is awesome for them, and honestly, Gen.G kind of looked like they took this game off, because as well as Chovy and Pays were playing, it's the players that came in to replace the HLE players, the current HLE players, that ended up really underperforming for Gen.G. The top side of the map was a bit of a disaster. They lost a lot of pressure in the jungle because of some really passive pathing and play from Canyon, and the Blitzcrank pick is just pure ego in this matchup because you don't have any good targets to end up latching onto. This is a very difficult game to play a playmaker into, and HLE took full advantage of that. They just were never really able to capitalize on any of the strengths that their comp has, Gen.G that is, and HLE was able to win 1v1 or 2v2 in a lot of different circumstances and pull themselves to a game 1 victory. So genuinely massive here. Player of the game is going to go to Doran. I did not have to think about this for more than like 1 second. This was a top lane gap. Like, this was not particularly close. Doran is known for stepping up in some pretty big moments in at least the LCK, like domestic runs here, the playoffs, if you will. On Gen.G in the past, he's done it for other teams as well, but he's kind of been a subject, I would say, a subject of conversation for a lot of HLE fans, for a lot of LCK fans. They're kind of up in the air about how much they like or don't like Doran. I am on record saying that I think Doran is much better than people give him credit for. I thought he really broke out in my mind last year for Gen.G. Obviously, he was already a star before that, but last year was the best year of his career, and honestly, I thought his summer split was super underrated by a majority of the community. To me, it was very clear he was the second best top laner behind Keen in the LCK, and I don't know, man. He comes out here in game number 1 and gaps Keen super hard in lane on, you know, Keen Sante, like with a Jax. That's crazy. That is an incredibly impressive performance, and Doran deserves all the credit and all of the praise that he's going to get for this game number 1. Again, a player that has stepped up in big moments domestically in the past. He does it again here. I think Peanut was also somebody that you really have to shout out. He was an MVP finalist for me. Him and Canyon both were, and you know, I think Peanut is another player that just gets way too much hate from the community. That's not going to be a shock to anybody who's been around the channel for more than like 2 weeks, but Peanut is one of the players that I, you know, continue to bang the drum for always. I think he's a top 10 minimum player of all time, regardless of position. I think he is a player that has consistently been one of the best junglers in the world for his entire career, and he still is one of the best junglers in the world. He gets disrespected because just generally players of his playstyle get disrespected, more facilitative, like tank-oriented junglers junglers typically don't get the same kind of praise as players like Canyon, but he is the best tank facilitative jungler in the world. Tarzan comes close, but, you know, he's had a different role over for Weibo Gaming, and Peanut is really kind of reignited that spark over the course of this split. He has been phenomenal for HLE, and he gapped Canyon. This was not a particularly close matchup between two players that have faced each other a lot. Zeka, Viper, Delight, they all played well. All of them were able to create their own advantages. They got the Smolder and the MF a ton of gold, and then, of course, the Jax was able to do a lot of damage in the back half, but this was a very clean, clinical win from HLE. They were just straight up better, and a lot of it was just the mechanical one-on-one differences. And then for Gen.G, this is really not how you expected this series to start off, just kind of getting gapped by HLE. I really do not think that was on their bingo card going into this series, but they certainly have some things to look out for now. I do think this is a bit of a greedy draft. As I said, the Blitzcrank in particular is just too much of an ego pick. The Blitz is not really doing anything this game, and I do think that there are plenty of other options in the support position that were available that would have been significantly more valuable this game, but Lehens wanted to be the playmaker, and, you know, this is kind of classic Lehens, going for something a little bit more risky rather than just going for the safe pick and winning the game, and Lehens is going to get dud of the game for me for it, because not only was the pick itself bad, but it ended up being a huge problem for Gen.G that they didn't really have any peel over the course of this game. And so, you know, the Zeri and the Ezreal and these champions that you are trying to enable to do damage, they can't, because Blitzcrank isn't exactly going to be setting them up in the right positions to do so. So Lehens is going to get it for me, but I know a lot of people want to give this to Keen in the top lane. Keen was horrendous in this game on the K'Sante. This is genuinely one of the worst games that he's played over the course of this split. It simply has to be better. Getting gapped by Doran is not the worst thing in the world, but it cannot be a consistent thing. Keen, I expect him to get back into this series, but not a great way to start. Canyon also got mega gapped. I get people are like frustrated that he has been playing more tanks for this team, but he has been a really good tank player for them over the course of this year. And so I'm really not shocked to see them prioritize things like Maokai, because that's what they've liked to do for a lot of this split. I just don't know if that's the direction they're going to want to go and take these like facilitative jungle matchups against someone like Peanut, who probably is just better at this style than Canyon is. So definitely something to consider. Chovy, Pays, they were, you know, trying along for the ride. They weren't exactly dominating, but they weren't exactly the problem either. Gen.G just wasn't in a good spot because, again, their top, their jungle, and their support were just really, really bad this game. And so they've got to bounce back. If they can get a lot closer to their performances, the expected performances, it's going to be fine. It's just game number one. You're not panicking just yet. But if HLE somehow manages to go up 2-0 in this series, I mean, Gen.G having to win 3 games in a row, all of a sudden that becomes a lot more difficult, and HLE is clearly a lot more talented than people were giving them credit for. So a big game number 2 here from both teams, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and this is much more of the Gen.G we expected to get going into this series. This was just phenomenal gameplay coming in from them, a bit of a mechanical diff in this game. HLE did put up at least a little bit of a fight. It looked like they were trying, but their mistakes were a lot more egregious than Gen.G's, who just had the best players on the Rift in this game, and that's usually enough to get you across the finish line. I'm not going to beat around the bush. This was a spectacular game from Pays in the bot lane here for Gen.G. He is the easiest possible choice for player of the game that I could possibly give here in game number 2. This is a phenomenal Kalista performance. We've actually seen this champion really underperform in a lot of the other playoffs, and specifically the West, it's really not been all that good. You know, specifically pick it, I'm not going to say as a counter to Misfortune, but it is often picked purely to stop something like Misfortune from having an easy laning phase. You can dominate the 2v2 if you pick something like Renata to be able to go with it. It's why it was always so successful in the past, but some people view Kalista, again, a lot differently than maybe she is in reality. She's very similar, in my opinion, to something like a Caitlyn in terms of the bell curve, where she is really strong in lane. She's going to be able to, you know, brute force kind of dominate you in the 2v2, especially with a strong support. She falls off really hard in the middle of the game, where she's just really not able to do as much as a lot of the other AD carries, but when you get to that late game, when you get a ridiculous amount of attack speed on her, she can still carry a lot of these late game team fights, and Pays was really in a position to make the most of that. This game didn't even really go all that late. He wasn't even really at like mega max Kalista by the end of this game. He was just so freaking good in these fights that it didn't end up really mattering. Pays was my MVP pick for a reason. I still think it's ridiculous that he wasn't even in the conversation for a lot of people. I just don't even really understand it, if I'm being entirely honest with you. I don't understand what there isn't to like about Paze's game. I've even seen some people be making like top 5 AD carry in the world lists, and Paze isn't in them. I think it's absurd. Like, this guy has a case to be made that he is playing like the best AD carry in the world at the current moment in terms of the performances that he's put out. This is the second straight year that Summer Split has been super dominant for him. I get his job is a bit easier than maybe some of the other AD carries right now, especially some of the ones on like actually bad teams, but his role is super important on this team that has been undefeated. He might be the most valuable player for them at the moment, and that's certainly not something to scoff at. Lehens was also really good on Renata. It takes two to tango down in the bot lane. Much less of an ego pick here in game number 2, actively just picking something to be able to get that lead in the early game, and it ends up working out. Who would have thought? Lehens, when locked in, actually plays well. Canyon was much better here on Nidalee. You know, Canyon, Nidalee, all of the memes, everything like that. You know, this champion, again, has been pretty hit or miss for a lot of teams across the world, but if there's anybody I trust to play Nidalee at a high level, it's definitely Canyon. Keen was better, still not great, but definitely better than he was in game 1. Chovy was fine on the Smolder. Somehow, some way, he was like one of the lesser relevant members of Gen.G in this game, but overall, just a really good game number 2, and an important bounce back here. Going down 0-2 would have been kind of a disaster for them, but for HLE on the other side, this was more of what I was expecting, I'll be honest. In this series, I was expecting HLE to just be in a position where they weren't quite on the same level as Gen.G, where 1 or 2 or 3 players on the other side were just popping off, and even if you were trying to make some decent plays throughout this game, you just didn't really have the firepower to keep up with them. This was much more of the anticipated result. Dud of the game for me could go to quite a few people. This was honestly kind of a difficult one to pick, but I'm going to give it to Zeka because this Yone was completely invisible, entirely irrelevant throughout the entirety of this game, and this is one of Zeka's signature picks, especially in this meta where things like Akali are just not all that valuable. When you're looking for this like AD carry melee assassin mid laner that can take over, like Yone is number 1 on the priority list, and so for Zeka to get that into a matchup that he should be able to win early, where as long as Zyra is alive, like you should be able to pressure the mid lane, for that to just never really turn into anything, and for Zeka to be entirely irrelevant throughout a majority of this game, it's really just not ideal, and so he's gonna get Dud of the game for me for that. But Peanut, Delight, they were also on my radar. Viper was on my radar for Dud of the game. It's not like Doran played all that much better than everybody else. This just wasn't a particularly strong game from HLE, and you would expect that hopefully they'll be able to turn it around in game number 3, but now that the series is evened up at 1 apiece, you're essentially entering a best of 3, a regular season matchup, and that's where HLE has really faltered a lot against Gen.G over the course of this year. It's certainly not like the best situation, but you still got that game 1 win. You showed that you can take advantage of Gen.G if they are playing below their level, but the problem for HLE right now is it feels like Gen.G has to be the one to mess up rather than, you know, HLE being the team to step up. Even if they play perfect, Gen.G's best game is just better than HLE's. So we'll see how the rest of this series goes, but a very, very important game 3 to win. HLE can really get a lot of that momentum back if they can win this game number 3 and push Gen.G to match point. That would be pretty miraculous. So we'll see if they can do that, or if Gen.G is going to show that game 1 was definitely more of an outlier, because the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to go up in this series 2-1, and they have taken full control. This is the Gen.G we expected to get in this series, which feels a lot more dominant. Now, a lot of people are pointing to draft gap. Everybody on this channel that has followed for more than a couple of weeks knows that is truly a phrase that I try to invoke as little as possible. I honestly think it is very difficult to have draft gap in a pro game at this level. I think Gen.G would win regardless of whether or not they had a good draft, and I'm going to be honest, I don't think this is that big of a draft gap. I understand the idea of HLE being a bit too low damage to break through things like Nasus in the later half of the game, and that is definitely something that's a bit concerning, but all of that goes away if you play your early game right and actually get some gold onto the Azir. Like, genuinely, none of that is a problem. Azir actually can break through a lot of these, like, tanks, and I know it's going to be a bit difficult to do so, and maybe it's too risky of a comp to draft into something like Gen.G. Drafting kind of a 1-carry comp is really not ideal, especially in the current meta, but I don't hate this nearly as much as everybody in the community seems to. That was really the only response to this game was, oh god, draft was unwinnable for HLE. I just don't really see it that way. I think they just got outplayed. Their game plan was kind of niche to execute, and they didn't execute on it. And so it is what it is, right? It's game number 3, and they lost it. And now they're down 1-2 in the series. Where do you go from here? For Gen.G, you go pretty far up, because this was a really nice bounce back from a couple of bad games here from Keen in the top lane, who is going to get player of the game on the Nasus. Again, this champ just can't really seem to make up as mind on whether he wants to be useful or useless. I think a lot of it comes down to whether or not teams actually put some pressure into him in the early game. If he's able to get to the mid to late game and he's like relatively even, like it's over. Like there's really not a lot you can do into this champ. The consistency of the stack like building is obviously great. The damage is pretty good, but it's the tankiness that becomes like such an issue. Like the damage is fine. Like he's definitely the highest damage like late game top laner, but he's not gonna like break your team in half by himself. There are a lot of champions in the game that can blow up your game, like Smolder and like a Zeri. Like he's kind of on par with them, but it's the tankiness that becomes a bit of a problem. He might not actually have a ton of tools to be able to utilize that, and we've seen in quite a few games that if you just kite him out, like there's really nothing he can do about that. He has no gap closer, he has no mobility, he has no way to stick on you without the wither, and there are a lot of champions that just have like dashes or, you know, ways to, I guess, immune that wither. But at the end of the day, if Nasus just stands there and you can't kill him, then it doesn't matter how long you kite him out for. You can't really ever like do anything to him. So that ends up being the biggest problem, is his survivability, and that's kind of what makes Nasus so difficult to deal with. But it also is what makes him like dealable with in games where he does get behind. So I'm not in the opinion of Nasus being broken. Like I don't agree with that. I think he's strong, and I think he will probably be getting nerfed, but you know, he's fine. He's fine as a champion right now as long as you're able to execute on him. It's nice that Keen was able to get a better game on him than he was in the first couple of games, because Keen was the one member in game 2 that I was still feeling a bit up in the air about, but this was definitely a lot better, a lot easier to execute on something like Nasus. I do want to give a big shout out to Canyon as well. I thought he had a really good game on the Skarner. Skarner is a pick that I'm really starting to believe in. I wasn't so sure the first couple times I saw it in North America when it was really kind of regaining some popularity, but as I've seen more of it in North America and now like spread out across the other regions, I do think that Skarner is definitely one of those picks that can still be very valuable. His kit is just so inherently good. Even if his numbers really aren't all that good right now, he's still able to accomplish quite a bit purely just from being Skarner. So you'll definitely take that. Chovy, Pays, and Lehens were all really good here. Pays continues to go deathless in a lot of these games. Lehens was also really good here, but overall this was a Nasus game and they just couldn't quite break through that. For HLE, again, I understand the idea that you're worried that, oh, this is just too low damage. Drafting, you know, Senna plus Ornn without really any sort of carry in the jungle or the top lane is a bit of a problem, and I do kind of agree in the sense that I would have gone in a different direction. I just don't think this game is unwinnable from draft. They just needed to have a better performance from the middle of the map, and they just didn't get that. Zeka is going to get my dead of the game here for game 3. Wasn't enthused by the Azir performance. Again, if he's fed, if he's winning in the mid lane matchup, which is certainly not out of the realm of possibility, with you sending things like Vi mid lane and getting Azir into a decent position, like if you were able to do that, I think this game is much more winnable. Maybe you don't have the damage to break through the Nasus, but you certainly have enough damage to ignore the Nasus in a lot of circumstances and win fights in other ways, and it just didn't happen, right? Like Zeka was never able to get online, and honestly, he's not having a particularly good day. It's not really a great sign that he's not playing well, but it is Chovy on the other side of this matchup. I'm not going to blame him entirely. Doran probably had his worst game of the series. Peanut, I really didn't like his pathing decisions. I just wanted to see him put a lot more time and effort into Azir in the middle of the map, and it just didn't happen. Viper's build was about as low damage as you could possibly get. Delight wasn't really getting to do anything in this game either, even if the bot lane wasn't the biggest problem. There are definitely some pluses and minuses, but mostly minuses for HLE, and I hate to say it, but it just feels like this is returning to normality after a bit of a shocking game number 1. This is kind of how we all expected this series to go, and now they're down 1-2. They are obviously not out if they lose this upcoming game, but I think they would love to push Gen.G to, at the very least, a Silver Scrapes game number 5. They would love to, you know, show that they can compete on this level, but right now Gen.G feels a lot more locked in than they did at the beginning of the series, and that is a bit of a problem for Hanwha. But are they going to be able to take that game number 4? Are they going to be able to even up this series and send us to game number 5, or is Gen.G going to close this out in 4? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to take this series 3-1, and they will be moving on to the LCK finals. They have confirmed their spot, and by also getting into the top 2, they have now also confirmed their spot out of the regional qualifiers. It is now impossible for this team to get anything worse than the number 2 seed, regardless of what ends up happening in the LCK finals. This felt like an inevitability. We were still kind of playing into the idea that theoretically likely Gen.G might have to try and figure out their seeding through the regional qualifiers, but that never really felt like a possibility. Everybody expected them to at the very least make the finals, and that's exactly what they have done with this victory. Yet another dominating win here for Gen.G. For HLE on the other side, they just didn't have the firepower. They're not as good of a team as Gen.G is. Even if I do think they're very, very strong, there's just not enough here to be able to take down what is clearly the best team in the world at the current moment. Again, until proven otherwise, there's just no reason to call them anything else. So we'll quickly go through this game number 4. Honestly, not really a lot to talk about. Gen.G gets this gigantic lead that they just never really lose track of. This is a carry duo masterclass coming in from Chovy and Pays. Player of the game and player of the series as a whole is absolutely going to go to Pays. This guy went 18, 1, and 10, 100% KP on Jhin throughout this game. Just perfection. Like, Pays is unbelievable. Even in Game 3, he goes deathless. In Game 2, he's popping off. Perfect mechanics on the Kalista. I mean, it's everything you could ask out of a superstar AD carry and then some. This guy's filled ruler shoes. About as good as you could ever ask a 17, now 18-year-old to ever do. It's genuinely ridiculous how good this guy is at League of Legends at such a young age, being so, you know, inexperienced and being thrust into such an important opportunity for his team. He has stepped up at every single step of the way, and at this point, what is stopping him from being the best AD carry in the world right now? Like, truly, what barrier is in the way from that conversation happening? I get that people really want to look at him as somebody that hasn't necessarily proven it yet, because last year ended the way that it did, and, you know, he had his ups and downs in the spring split, but he's had 4 full splits at the LCK level, and in 3 of those, he's been an absolute stud for Gen.G. 2 of those, in my opinion, he's been the best player and the most valuable one in the entire league. This guy is sensational, and yes, again, I want to reiterate, I understand this idea that his job is just easier than some other AD carries, but you cannot take away what he is able to do for this team. This team trusts him a lot, and they're playing through him for a reason. They're the best team in the world, and right now, he is the primary carry. That is a very, very huge role for him. I think Chovy obviously also deserves a ton of credit and shoutouts for this series. The Corki was awesome in game number 4. I would argue this was his best game of the series. He's just awesome. I mean, it's Chovy. Even when he's playing more passive and even when he's playing for the rest of his team, rather than to get himself ahead, he still looks like one of the best players in the world. He is just ridiculous. He's a cheat code. Lehens was much better on the Blitzcrank here in game 4. This is a much more acceptable situation to pick the Blitzcrank into, and they were more than willing to try to play through a lot of the hooks that Lehens was able to create. Canyon, I thought, was really good down the stretch here. Peanut was not really able to keep up. Keen, definitely better in the second half of the series than he was in the first half. Just everything going right for Gen.G, and it just more so felt like they locked in and kind of got back to their own game plan rather than just kind of taking it easy. It didn't really feel like they were all that concentrated in game number 1, and so I am just going to chalk it up to natural variance, and now this team is going to be moving on to the LCK finals. But for HLE, you know, it's really hard to get a read on how you should feel about this, because Gen.G, like, it's not like he came in this series expecting to beat them. Honestly, I think a lot of people were expecting a 3-1. That was my anticipation. That's what ended up playing out. Like, this is kind of just the expectation for a team like Hanwha. If you are very talented, you're good enough to take a game off of Gen.G when they're not necessarily playing perfect, but you just don't really have the firepower, as I've said multiple times this series, to be able to beat them when they are actually trying, when they are actually playing well, when you have Chovy and Pays and Lehens all stepping up and playing like they did here in game 4. Dud of the game, once again, as I've said a couple of times, could really go to anybody. I mean, this was really a team loss and a team win. This wasn't one player just kind of dominating or throwing things away for HLE. Delight is going to get it for me. I think bot lane, just the Leona didn't work. There was really nothing that this Leona did. I'm generally pretty low on this champion in comparison to other engaged supports, but the Rakan, the Nautilus, they were banned out this game. You know, something like the Rel, I think, would have been a little bit more applicable in a situation like this, but you wanted to go for the Leona to set up more for the Ziggs. I understand the idea behind it, but just not really enough tempo to be able to really do anything to shut down the Jhin early on and to make the Blitzcrank's life harder. You had someone like Peanut, who I think really struggled down the back half of this series. You know, people talk about Peanut being a choker. I completely disagree with that narrative. This guy is a multiple time LCK champion. He's not somebody that I expect to, I guess, not perform in big moments. He definitely gets nervous. You can see it on his face, but it's not necessarily affected him in the same way that I think some of the narratives would lead you to believe, but this was not a very good example of that. I think this was honestly just him not being good enough to be able to outpace all of Gen.G. You know, Zeka really struggled struggled in the first half of this series. I think this was his best game, arguably, of the entire series, but couldn't really do much on the Zeri to be able to salvage this. Doran looked awesome at the start, was just better than Keen in the first half, and then everything started to catch up to Gen.G, and so for HLE, it's really hard to feel frustrated with them. This was the expected outcome, and even if they are moving down now into the semifinals, I don't really think I have a lesser opinion of them. They should still be the favorite to get their rematch with Gen.G in the finals, so long as, you know, nothing crazy happens. Not saying that it's impossible for them to lose, but I don't think I'm coming out of this series feeling significantly worse about HLE or anything like that. But for Gen.G, they're just too dominant. They just are the best team in the LCK and in the world right now, and it's just really hard to view them in any other way. They're so complete across the board. The only times they ever lose are when they beat themselves, and now they're going to be heading to the finals, and just as we've been talking about in all of these series, they're going to be gigantic favorites to win that too. But then moving on to our second series of the video, and it's not quite the stakes of winners finals, but we will know our first team to lose out and be eliminated here in the double elimination stage of the LCK bracket. It's the number 3 seeded Dplus KIA taking on the number 4 seeded T1. These are, of course, the two teams that ended up winning in round 1 and then losing in round 2 to get here to the lower bracket, and both of them suffered similar fates in the same way that we talked about how Gen.G and HLE both got their 3-0s. Both of these teams got 3-0'd coming into these series. Neither of them won any games in their round 2 matchup, and both are looking quite shaky. Not exactly the expectation that I think these teams had coming into the playoffs. I think that's more understandable for one than maybe the other. I think T1 certainly had higher expectations regardless of the fact that they didn't perform particularly well in the regular season. I think they came into playoffs with the idea that they were just going to turn it around and make it better for themselves, and that has not quite happened just yet for them, but I still believe in them. I still believe that this is a team that will get better as the playoffs go along. That's just what's happened every single year, and I try not to forget what's happened in 2 straight years. Those are typically good signs that it will happen again. For DK, I am a bit more concerned because I do think this team has just generally overperformed a lot in the summer split. I think that they have gotten better, do not get me wrong. I think players like Lucid and Aiming, I think, have definitely improved over what they were in the spring split and have definitely raised the quality of this team and the consistency of this team, but they still rely a little bit too much on Showmaker in the middle of the map for me to feel entirely comfortable with them, which is why I felt pretty comfortable taking T1 in my predictions when I did my full bracket up until this point, which obviously is going to chalk up until this point. It's no real surprises, and I don't think anybody would be shocked if T1 were able to come out and win this, but in terms of where DK can come out and get their advantages in a matchup like this, ironically enough, I think top lane is certainly an area you could look at. Kingen has just been better than Zeus for a majority of this split, and while Kingen's not the most dominating figure, he's beaten Zeus once. World Finals back in 2022 is definitely still on the mind for these players, and so you never really know if he can get a pretty big lead on the top side. I could see that being a positive for DK, as well as just being able to play through Showmaker. I don't think they're going to have an advantage in the bot lane or, you know, maybe in the jungle, I guess, if everything were to go right, but if Showmaker can pop off regardless of whether or not Faker is back or whether he's playing well, then I think that's going to be a good situation for DK to sit in. But on the flip side of this, you know, T1 has a pretty big advantage, in my opinion, coming into this series on paper. I think basically every single lane you can look at and expect them to do better in. You know, their bot lane was really bad against Hanwha Life. Guma and KIA really did not step up. However, there's really no reason to believe that that will carry over into a series like this. Guma and KIA should be the better of these two bot lanes. I especially expect KIA going into someone like Moham that just doesn't have a ton of experience at this level to be pretty big in T1's favor if they are able to play out the macro game in the mid game. Also, you're kind of, if you're DK, relying on players like Faker and Zeus underperforming, and you just don't really count on that in series like this. It's really hard to just predict that Faker's bad run of form is going to continue as games get more important. Typically speaking, he is a player who steps up in big moments. He's the GOAT for a reason, and Zeus has honestly been kind of similar, at least in the domestic playoffs over the past couple of years. His performances have been better than they've been in the regular season, or at the very least more consistent. The highs have been higher. You know, Owner definitely has some trouble in the early game, but Lucid's not exactly the kind of jungler that punishes early game mistakes. He is the type of jungler that wants to play this slower, more methodical paced game. He likes his Maokai and his Sejuani and his Vi, and, you know, a lot of these more tank engagers. That's definitely a more comfortable style for Lucid in terms of what he has shown, and so Matchup-wise, I think T1's actually in a pretty good spot here, and so I would expect them to be able to win it in the same way that I talked about in my preview. Nothing's really changed leading into this, but who knows, maybe DK can actually cause a surprise. They were better than T1 in the regular season in terms of their performances. We'll see if they can keep that up in a playoff series like this, but the only way to find out is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Dplus KIA. They are going to take game number 1 of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and Ziggs strikes again for T1. I know T1s are very frustrated and angry with this champion and with it being let through draft a couple of times. Hanwha Life obviously did numbers on T1 with the Ziggs, moving it around the map, constantly taking every tower, and just generating these gigantic early leads that T1 was not able to recover from, and I think fans are upset that they let it through again here in game number 1, and now they are down in a deficit. I really hate this draft from T1. Obviously, I don't hate K'Sante, Maokai, Corki. This is probably the most consistent trio in the entire game. I don't think I love it for T1, mostly because Owner is just not the kind of player I want to see on something like Maokai. I really don't think it gets the best out of him individually as a player, but what the hell is Neela Zilean? Like, what is this? This is cooking, like, way too much. I just don't understand the idea of what's even supposed to happen here. I would say Zilean in isolation is pretty decent. Into Dplus KIA's comp, you have a lot of tools to be able to shut down pieces like the Taliyah or the Ziggs or the Leona or even the Vi, right? Like, you have pieces to be able to shut down some of the hard engage that they have on their side, but what are we doing with Neela? Like, I just don't particularly understand why this champion was picked at all, really. I don't think she's particularly good. She's very squishy. She needs to be able to blow up targets, and Dplus KIA is really not all that easy to blow up. Like, I don't get it. Like, I don't really understand the idea behind it, and man, did it really come back to bite them. This Neela's not good, and if you are going to go for something like Neela, you sure as hell can't then pick Zilean on R5. Like, this duo just has no synergy, and I just don't really understand what the point of it was. Like, I guess the idea is maybe you throw the bomb on Neela and she dives in, but, like, that's it? Like, that's all you're going off of? This laning phase was a disaster. They weren't able to stop the Ziggs at all. He was able to move around the map and do everything that Hanwha Life was able to do with Ziggs against them, and then there was really no rebounding from that, and so really don't like the game plan here from T1. I think they let themselves down quite a bit in game number 1, but for DK, you executed well. Aiming is going to get player of the game here. You know, he's become what he's hated, a Ziggs player, a long-range artillery mage. Very funny to see that, but, you know, Ziggs is one of those champs that just kind of does what he does. T1's biggest weakness has always been their early game macro decisions. That's always been a weakness for the team. I'm not trying to say that they're a bad macro team. T1 has always been a really good macro team, but the difference between T1 and, like, a lot of other teams that have been around them, and the reason they've sometimes struggled in the regular season as this group of 5, going back years at this point, is because their early game decision-making can sometimes just be left up to, okay, well, I hope we're in a good spot. Like, they're really good in the mid and late game at deciding where they need to go, and they're very clean at being able to end out games even from neutral positions, but they're always in neutral positions, even with really talented players, and that's really not where they should be. And so when you have a team like DK, or really just a champion like Ziggs that really thrives on heavy macro in the early game, yeah, you're able to get basically everything on the map that you could want, and aiming was everywhere. This was a really good game from him. I think Moham really enabled this. Showmaker really enabled this on the Taliyah. I think that made it a lot easier for the rest of the team to kind of figure out the direction that they wanted to go, but overall, like, this is a very standard game from DK. They didn't do anything all that exceptional. They just kind of pulled apart T1 in a lot of different directions and ended up just getting this gold lead that they then were able to win fights with, and that's a problem for T1. If there was ever a way to attack T1 as a team, it's through things like this, just incremental leads, and then being able to get such a big gold lead that they're really good team fighting in the later half of the game just is irrelevant and doesn't matter. So really nice stuff from DK, but for T1, like I said, you gotta go away from this. Like, Neela Zilean, not acceptable. Like, this is just not something that you can get away with in the playoffs. I'm sorry, there is just no excuse for this champion to be picked. Like, Neela in general. I think Zilean, again, like, there is some argument to be made here that it's pretty good into DK's comp, and that, you know, Zilean himself is not all that bad right now, but I can't justify this. Like, there is no explanation for why they would go for this. Guma is going to get dud of the game. Show me one thing Neela did this game that wasn't, like, truly horrendous. This was just a really bad performance from Guma and a really bad decision, I would say, overall from T1. I think the bailout for them is that this is game 1, but it's not like everybody on this team played fine, and then, you know, the Neela was just running it down. I don't think Owner was good at all. He lost all of the tempo possible in the early game on Maokai. I really hate him on champions like this. You know, it's why Sejuani has really been the one tank that I've felt comfortable with Owner on, because Sedge actually has prio in the early game. She actually can skirmish and do things, and she can invade, and she can contest, and she can play around objectives. Maokai can't really do that until he starts to get items, and so you end up in these situations where Owner can't really do the thing that he's best at, and he can't feel comfortable in the game, and then by the time you get to the late game with Owner playing super passive, you're already down a ton of gold because T1 actually requires their laners to win in order to stay neutral, because that's just what they do. That's how they play the game. It's really not a good combination, and I think even when you talk about the K'Sante, Maokai, Corki, like, trio that has been, you know, everywhere in the world over the past couple of weeks, like, it's not for T1. This is not the kind of comp that I think they would succeed on, and I think they only exacerbated that by picking whatever the hell this bot lane is. So I would imagine something's got to change moving into game number 2. This draft cannot stay the same and then feel good about it. Like, there's just no way. But for DK, you were able to take advantage of T1 when they did some weird things. Can you beat them when they're actually drafting things that they are comfortable on? That remains to be seen. This was a good game from DK. I don't think they did anything exceptional, though. It was mostly T1 just shooting themselves in the foot and DK kind of walking over it. And so we'll see what ends up happening in game 2. But going down 0-2 for T1, especially because their struggles have been very real as of late, would be a disaster. If DK can get that lead, that is a major mental buff. Winning one of the final 3 games is very much almost guaranteed, I would say, for a team like DK. So a big game 2 for both of these teams, but only one team can take it. Who will it be? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and now we are much more along the timeline I think we expected to have. I will say we did not get there the way that I thought we would. This was not a, like, normal game number 2 from T1. They really required one of those major playoff performances that we were talking about in the preview for this series, but lucky for them, they ended up getting it because player of the game is going to go to definitely the star and standout, Zeus, on the top side. We were talking about how that could potentially be an inroad for Dplus KIA, that Kingan actually plays pretty well into Zeus, and Zeus has been really out of form as of late. Kingan's been pretty good over the course of this year, but man, Zeus popped off in this one, and if he's going to play like this throughout this series, it is going to be relatively doomed for DK to be able to get back and win it, because this was an unbelievable performance, an unbelievable carry performance from Zeus. Camille is actually a champion that I've been pretty critical of on this channel. It's performed very poorly in a lot of the different regions. It's been this really aggressive, like, R5 type of pick that a lot of teams are just kind of going towards if they want to get something crazy in the top lane, if they really want to play through the top of the map, and it's just not worked. It's really not worked for anybody that's been able to pick it up, regardless of the talent level between the player and the one that they're playing against, or the team and they're playing against. Like, even good teams are losing with Camille right now. So to see Zeus pick it up, get snowballed very early, and just completely take over this game, it's a really good sign, and it shows that Zeus really did pop off. Like, it's not just Camille being ridiculously broken. Now, I do want to say, Gangplank did not make it hard on the other side of this matchup. I do not get R5 Gangplank. I really just don't understand the idea behind Gangplank plus Nasus as your solo lane duo. Like, really, what are we trying to accomplish here? We'll talk about it for DK, but it just feels so boring and passive with a Maokai. Like, you're giving up pressure everywhere on the map, and T1 absolutely was able to take advantage of that. I think it's the opposite of what DK should be doing in this matchup, but Zeus certainly is not the one you should be criticizing for it. He absolutely stepped up and looked amazing here. Aguma was doing 1 billion damage, even though he clearly was not particularly comfortable on the Ziggs. We've seen why this team, you know, doesn't pick Ziggs in this game. It's not a particularly good style for Guma. He's very much like an AD carry player. He can play mages in the bot lane, but Keria does a lot of these weird things in the support position. It really makes Guma feel a lot more comfortable when he's just kind of doing his own thing and doing the AD carry thing. I think he's a lot more, you know, adept at that style. So picking Ziggs, not exactly ideal for T1, but if that's the way you have to take that champion away from enemy teams because clearly you don't know how to play against it, then that's fine. Like, whatever you have to do, because even if Guma wasn't very good in the early part of this game, he was doing 1 billion damage in the back half of it because Ziggs is just pretty good right now. So credit to Guma. Keria was an absolute madman this game on the Alistair. Some ridiculous engages that were just wild to watch. Owner was really solid on the Sedge. Again, this is the tank that you need to go towards if you're T1, because it's one of the few tanks, like facilitative junglers, that actually does have that prio and that pressure in the early game to be able to exploit some passiveness from the enemy team. And then, of course, Faker was solid on Corki. Overall, this was Zeus taking over on Camille, but a pretty decent game all around, I would say, from T1. And for DK, what are we doing? Like, I hate complaining about draft. I'm really not a draft guy. I don't think draft gap is nearly as big as people make it out to be. Like, I think that there are a lot of win conditions to basically every draft, and even this DK draft absolutely has its win conditions. If you can get to the part of the game where you have Nasus, who's unkillable in the mid lane, and you've got a Maokai that's controlling every objective, and Gangplank can, you know, win every team fight because he does a billion damage, then I understand the idea behind picking these champions, but it's just so risky, and it's so rare that you were able to get to the part of the game where a lot of these champions are able to do the things that they do without somebody guiding them there. Like, if you're going to pick Gangplank plus Nasus as a or as a solo lane duo, you can't pick Maokai. Like, I just don't think that that is acceptable in this draft. I think going 3 really passive champions in all 3 of your topside roles is just not good. You've got an Ezreal who's like weak side bot lane as well, so I just don't really get like what the idea behind this is. I don't know what you're supposed to do pre-15 minutes, because you're not really able to skirmish, you're not really able to pressure any lanes, you're not really able to gank, and so where exactly do you go? I don't know. It just feels very weird. Showmaker's gonna get dud of the game. The Nasus definitely showing its flaws here. We've talked about the good. When it comes to Nasus, we can talk about the bad as well. We talk a lot about how he's unkillable in the back half of the game because he is so tanky and he just naturally has damage, so he doesn't need to invest a ton of that into his build. But if you don't get there, this champion is worthless in the early game. There are so many ways to exploit and kite out Nasus, and that's the problem, right? Is this guy has no sticking power outside of Wither. He has no way to actually do the thing that he's good at unless he can actively just walk at you and survive everything that you're doing and, you know, land 1 Q. If he can't do that, if you can kite him out, or if you can blow him up, or if you can Hextech ultimatum him and just not really allow him to move anywhere, then all of a sudden Nasus becomes entirely useless because this champ has no utility. He has nothing else. He's literally just a walking stat stick, and so when you can shut him down, it's a real big problem, and Showmaker was not relevant really at all this game. You know, same thing about Lucid. Maokai does not look particularly good in this series because I think both teams want to have some level of prio in the early game. I like Ezreal Nautilus, but like not much to do here, and King, I guess, generally had an okay game, but I just don't like the Gangplank pick. I think that that really handicapped and, you know, hamstrung a lot of what DK could do in the early game, and they ended up paying the price for it. So now the series is tied up at 1 apiece. It's not over by any means. Both of these teams kind of throwing away games, if you will, at the beginning of this series because of their weird drafts, and so if one of them can continue to outdraft the other, they're probably going to have a pretty big edge in this series. But game 3, as you guys know, the most important game in the series, in my opinion, when you are tied up at 1 apiece. Getting that momentum and only having to win one of the final 2 is a huge burden off of their shoulders, and so only one team can take that. Who will it be? Well, the winner of game number 3 was T1. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up for the first time in this series, 2-1, and they have taken full control. This just continues to get worse and worse for Dplus KIA. This was not a good game here in game number 3. I think a lot of game 1 felt like T1 making, you know, critical errors and losing themselves the game. A lot of game 2 felt like there just weren't a lot of options for DK after they opted into this like hyper-scaling comp that just had no ability to play early on. But in game 3, it was mistake after mistake, and it was gap after gap that ended up separating T1, and that's really a big positive for them. I think getting their mechanical ceiling back is hugely influential in their ability to actually compete on the world stage or on the international stage if they do end up making there. You know, it's not locked in by any means, but it's likely going to be something that we're looking at, and so, you know, T1 getting that back for this playoff run I think is very, very crucial for them. But as I said for DK, like, it's just horrible. Horrible gameplay, horrible decision-making, bad laning, bad macro, bad everything. Like, this was just a bad game from them, and this is the problem. This team doesn't seem to understand how to play against actually good teams. It seems that they are a bit of, like, bad team merchants, and even when they beat bad teams, they're not winning early. They're capitalizing on their really good team fighting with players like Lucid and Aiming really exceeding in that part of the game, Kingen really exceeding in that part of the game, but they don't really have, like, a versatile, you know, skill set. They don't have a lot of tools at their disposal to win in multiple ways, and it's really coming back to bite them in situations like this. T1 is just straight up better than them right now, and they're on the back foot. They are 1 game away from being eliminated here in the LCK playoffs, which is really not ideal for them. But for T1, player of the game for me is going to go to Faker in the mid lane. Man, we've been waiting for a performance like this for a while. Faker has honestly been really off his game ever since MSI. I don't really know what happened at MSI. There were a lot of rumors floating around that he was having like pretty serious wrist problems. I don't know how like real that is. It's hard to really know unless you're inside the building, but whatever the problem was, it certainly didn't just go away in the summer split. He really has not been all that good for T1. He's been fine. He's been like an average mid laner here in the LCK, but that's not really what you expect out of Faker, especially because it felt like, you know, in spring and specifically last year in 2023, there was like a complete career resurgence in the sense that he was playing some of the best league he's ever played in the history of his career last year. It's just not really been the case so far in the summer split. He's more so just been a guy on the team, and honestly, his laning stats aren't all that good. And so to see him have a game like this on Corki, where yes, he's going into LeBlanc, which is a complete troll pick, certainly not something that is valuable in the current meta, but, you know, as long as he's able to win, it doesn't really matter what the matchup is. Like, him getting ahead in this situation and being able to carry the game in the later half with damage, very, very valuable. It wasn't just him, though. Big shoutouts to Zeus once again on the top side. This top lane's starting to look like a gap, but not the one that I was talking about in my preview. It's the complete opposite. Zeus is abusing Kingin in the matchup right now. It's really just not particularly close. The scoreline doesn't look nearly as good as the game that Zeus played. This was an exceptional Yone game from him, and this really punishes blind pick Aatrox. Like, this is just not something you can get away with against a team like T1 and against a player like Zeus, who you know is going to be aggressive in these situations. Owner was really good in this game as well on the Sedge, setting up a lot of the plays that did end up being made by T1, and, you know, Owner's just really good when he actually gets to set tempo in the early game. Who would have thought that playing the more proactive jungler on the side of T1 is going to actually make it a lot easier for them to win? I still think DK just has to move away from Maokai. You have to have something that can do something in the early game, because clearly that is way too crucial for DK, and Guma was still fine. Like, the Ziggs continues to be a pretty valuable pick. Keria was good this game on the Leona, but overall, this is just another team win for T1, and once again, we get to see the trend of whoever is actively being able to generate their own leads in the early game is able to win games, and that's not even T1's specialty. They're still able to do it just because DK is not really good at playing from behind, and they're often opting into these comps that just don't really have a lot of options. Dud of the game is, like, very obviously going to go to Kingin. This is genuinely one of the worst games that he has played all year long. This is a really bad time for him to just completely collapse in the top lane. This Aatrox was really bad in this series. Like, I cannot stress that enough. This game number 3 was horrible from him. He blind picks it, gets completely countered by the Yone, and then proceeds to int the game away over and over on his own world skim. It's just kind of a funny set of circumstances, but this is not something that you can get away with. Like, this is not something that you're just like, oh, it happens every so often. You can't have a game like this in a series as important as this one is for DK. A really big indictment on Kingin. I think Moham was also horrible on his signature champion here in the Rel. Really not looking good in this series. He has not really been a huge playmaker. He's not really been a big difference maker at all. You know, Moham feels very outclassed when he now has to go up against some of the better, you know, bot lanes and just teams in general in the LCK. Aiming was entirely irrelevant on a Jhin pick that I do think is strong, but not much to do. And then Maokai LeBlanc, like, Maokai's great. Like, I'm not trying to take anything away from the champion. There's a reason he has, like, really emerged as the #1 priority jungler in the world right now, but it's not good for this series. You need to establish pressure early. Both of these teams have proven that they're not really all that good at playing from behind in these circumstances. Owner has obviously shown that in Game 1 and just generally throughout his whole career, and we've seen it from DK. When you give T1 that lead, they're not going to let it go, and so picking something like Maokai that just does not have that much agency at the beginning of the game, it's a bit of a problem for the team, and they don't really have a way around it. That being said, like, LeBlanc is a complete nothing champion. I get that Showmaker was doing some damage in this game, but if you're looking for Showmaker to be on something that he can 1v9 on, LeBlanc just cannot do that. Any sort of CC completely ends her game, and her numbers are just not high enough right now to justify it. We've actually seen this champion perform incredibly poor in a lot of the other regions that she has been picked up in. I just do not think it's valuable to even consider picking LeBlanc at the current moment, and I think it really threw away some goodwill that Showmaker was generating in the early game, because he really wasn't all that bad in terms of performance in this game. But overall, DK just feels like they're on the back foot. They feel like they're not on the same level as T1. If they want to tie up this series, if they want to push this to a Game 5, they're going to have to do something in the early game. I think that that is a necessity, but T1, just stick to the strategy and you can close this out. These are very standard comps. You're saving R5 for someone like Zeus, who is now in really good form in this series in particular to be able to get that advantage on the top side, and if you do that, the rest of this team is going to fall into place. This has been a good series so far, but you have to close it out now. Game 5 can go to anyone, so you don't want to have it go to that. But I guess we'll see what ends up happening. Obviously, both teams with, you know, some opportunities to be able to take it, but this could potentially be the end of DK's domestic season. Regional qualifiers obviously notwithstanding, and T1 could be one game away from moving on to the semifinals, but can they close it out? The winner of game number 4 was T1. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series with a 3-1 win, and they will officially be moving on to the semifinals to get their rematch against Hanwha Life Esports. This is a very important win for T1. Obviously, both of these teams are kind of looking like they're in relatively similar positions, but with this win, DK, of course, now out of the playoffs. They are now in to the regional qualifiers as the number 4 seed. Regardless of what they do, they still have a chance to be able to go to Worlds as the number 3 seed. They're not out of the realm of possibility. They're not out of the running for that just yet, but, you know, I don't think this team is really feeling all that dominant at the current moment. Maybe they sneak in, like DK seems like one of those teams that might sneak in as a number 4 seed, but I don't feel better about DK coming out of this playoff run. I honestly had all of my fears realized in terms of what they showed in the playoff run, but for T1, this is them leveling up. This is them getting better and being better than what they were in the regular season, which is all we were really asking for. Is it enough? I don't really know just yet. The expectation for this team is top 2, and I don't really know if that's really achievable if they don't play, you know, about as good as they did here today. This seemed like a really big high roll in terms of some of the performances you got. I'm not sure if you can count on them being super repetitive, but it worked out here, and they were definitely better than DK, which is all you can really ask for, at least from this day. Player of the game in Game 4 is going to go to Owner in the jungle. Again, the Sejuani just felt so unbeatable. The Maokai felt so worthless throughout this entire series, and once again, I want to reiterate, I get the priority on Maokai. I understand that that champion is very strong, and I'm not trying to sit here and say that it's a gigantic mistake to end up picking Maokai, but clearly, as we learned throughout a lot of this series, early game pressure and early game priority was paramount towards the success of these teams. DK's only win was in a game where T1 really didn't have any options in the early part of the game, and DK took that away from themselves by picking Maokai into Sejuani every single game. Owner did much better and felt a lot more comfortable when he was the much more active jungler, and that's exactly the option and the opportunity that Lucid opted into every single game. And so, Owner looking great on the Sej. I continue to think this is the best jungler in the game, regardless of what pros think at the current moment. I think I felt a bit vindicated in this series, so credit to Owner. But player of the series, this is a no-brainer for me. It's got to go to Zeus in the top lane. This was a phenomenal performance from him. He dominated all 3 of their wins. Obviously, people are going to point to game 2, but he was exceptional at punishing Kingen in both games 3 and 4. The top lane gap in the back half of this series, the back 3/4 of this series was ginormous. Like, it genuinely wasn't even comparable how Zeus and Kingen were playing against each other, and that's a really big plus in favor of Zeus. He has been one of the reasons this team has underperformed so much over the course of this split, because he's really just not been in form. He's not been a top 3 top laner in the LCK. Kingen has been better, and so to see Zeus come out and not only play really well, but to make Kingen entirely irrelevant, especially on a pick like Corki top, like, it's a good sign, and it's a sign that Zeus is getting back into the form he needs to be in for this team to be able to compete at the highest level. Faker, I think, also had one of his more complete series in a while. I think one of the more encouraging signs as well is that Guma and Keria weren't really all that good. Like, Keria was very good in these games, but Guma didn't really have to do a whole ton, and honestly, I've been talking about it a lot. I think Guma has been 1v9 for a lot of this split for T1. I think we've gotten really bad performances from the top side of the map, and generally speaking, it's been up to the bot lane to actually do things for T1, to actively try to win them games, and for Guma to be the one to take a backseat and not be nearly as relevant throughout a lot of this series, that's an encouraging sign to me, because that's usually when T1 is at their best. When Guma can play weak side, when he plays things like Jhin and Ashe, and, you know, can just kind of do his own thing, be this utility marksman, and allow Keria to be this aggressive support that's moving around the map, and allow the top side of the map to be kind of the stars, the carries of the team. That's where everybody, I think, is at their most comfortable when it comes to T1. So that's a good sign, all things considered. So congratulations to T1. This is an expected victory. They were definitely favorites going into this series, but they got it done anyways, which is always a really good sign. But for DK on the other side of this, just a disaster. Like, this playoff run was about as bad as it could possibly get. I honestly don't think that there are almost any positives to take away from this playoff run for DK. This is just a really bad look. Kingen was miserable in this series. He's dud of the game in Game 4. I don't give a dud of the series, but let me tell you, if I did, Kingen better watch his numbers, because this was horrible. Like, he got completely gapped. He picked his own skin in Game 3 and got destroyed. He picked Corki top in Game 4 and got destroyed. I just didn't like it. Like, Aiming and Moham were supposedly one of the better bot lanes statistically in the entire league. Aiming broke all of these records in terms of what he was doing in output over the course of this regular season. He was like the kill leader and the DPM leader and the, you know, damage percentage leader, but like, where was that? This guy was completely invisible throughout a majority of this series. Got shut off in 2 games of Ziggs, or against 2 games games of Ziggs in games 2 and 3, and then he didn't do anything here on the Misfortune. Like, where was aiming that was breaking all of these records? It goes and reiterates the thought in my mind that they're empty stats, that he is one of those players that is almost entirely reliant on his own team doing things that are great so that he can follow up and take all of the resources and credit for it, and I'm just really not into that. I think Showmaker made some really questionable draft decisions throughout this series. The Nasus, the LeBlanc, I think both of those were really punished, and really I don't think there's something that DK should be prioritizing, and I've already gone on my rant about Lucid and the Maokai. You know, 3 straight games of Maokai, 4 games of Maokai in this series from both teams, and Maokai lost all 4. Really not an ideal set of circumstances, but I don't think that's an indictment on the champion strength. Again, it's an indictment on the idea of adaptation and this idea that, you know, you can just, give up jungle pressure and just go into the late game and you're going to be just fine. It's not how it worked in this series, and the fact that DK didn't realize that at any point, the fact that they didn't even try to move in a different direction, I feel like is just horrible from them. I just don't feel good at all about DK. I think this team is in a really bad state right now. I still think there's a good shot they make Worlds, if only because the LCK really is like a 5-team league at the current moment, and they just have to be top 4. They just have to be better than a team like KT Rolster in order to make Worlds, which is really not the hardest thing in the world to do, but I'm certainly not feeling more confident about DK coming out of the playoffs. But again, congratulations to T1. They have earned this victory. They have earned moving on, and they get their rematch with Hanwha Life. So far, this is playing out eerily similar to the Spring Split playoffs, in which they were able to make that upset happen, and they were able to move on to the finals. We'll see if they can get their revenge for a second time in the playoffs, but at least for now, just getting top 3, I think, is a pretty good sign for T1. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK Round 3 overview and analysis video here in the Summer Split Playoffs. Up on the screen, the updated bracket after round number 3. Only 3 teams remain. Gen.G has already carved their way into the finals here. That guarantees them a top 2 seed going to Worlds. We already kind of expected that to happen, but at the very least, it's locked in. We'll get to that a bit more later, but we know our semifinals as well. Hanwha Life coming down from the upper bracket, getting their rematch against T1. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to a series like this, because on paper, there's really no reason to believe that HLE is in any danger going up against T1. They just swept them 3-0 in round number 2, and honestly, when you look at the tape over the course of the Summer Split, these two teams have not been in the similar tier or category. Hanwha Life has definitely been the better of these two teams. The problem is that it's T1, that this is a team that always overperforms in the playoffs, that always figures it out when it matters the most, and this is also the exact same formula that we had in the Spring Split, where T1 was able to pick up that victory against HLE, go on to the finals, and make that even interesting. And so, you know, there is a lot at play here. I think if there ever was a time where HLE was going to conquer the Giant and send T1 into the regional qualifiers, I think this is it. I think HLE is better than they were in spring. I think T1 is worse than they were in spring. And so if there ever was a time for Hanwha Life to win, this is it. And I'm kind of predicting that. I know it feels crazy. It feels against my own, better decision, my own better judgment to not pick T1 in a series like this, but I just can't. There is nothing on tape that suggests that T1 will be better than Hanwha Life. As long as HLE shows up, they are the better team at cap, and that's what I am expecting to see in this series. But let me know if you agree or disagree with that. If you just want to go for T1, I understand. Even if there's not a lot of logic behind it at the current moment, I get that just from an emotional perspective. It's just basically impossible to root against them. So whatever decision you want to make, I completely understand, but let's quickly take a glance at our regional qualifiers. We now have the format locked in because Gen.G did qualify to the finals. They are guaranteed to get one of the top 2 seeds because of championship points, and so we do know that they will not be in the regional qualifiers. That makes things a lot easier in terms of previewing it. 3 of the 4 teams have also been determined here. It's, of course, KT Rolster and FearX, as we already knew. They're going to be the 5 and 6 seeds, but DK losing in 4th place is going to give them the number 4 seed in terms of championship points going into this tournament. And so they will have a chance to play one series and potentially still get the number 3 seed going to Worlds, but they will have to face one of Hanwha Life or T1, which is certainly not ideal for them. Obviously, I'm sure they would much rather face... Actually, probably, I don't know. They're probably not favorites against either, so I don't know who they would rather face, but they definitely still have a shot, which is at least something. That number 3 seed, like we said, will be the loser of Hanwha Life versus T1. If HLE ends up winning, they have more championship points than T1, regardless of if they lose in the finals. So that's another wrinkle, I guess, to that semifinals matchup, but DK will know who they are playing soon enough. But I imagine that it's going to go pretty much to chalk, not a lot to change here, not a lot to discuss when it comes to the regional qualifiers. But that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're gonna be covering the rest of the LCK year, the semifinals, the finals, the regional qualifiers, all of that stuff we will be covering on this channel, but we cover all of the other regions as well. LCS, their playoffs are still going on. NACL, their playoffs are still going on. Of course, the LPL and LEC are done, but Worlds is right around the corner. We're gonna be doing a ton of content and coverage of that tournament as per usual. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all